It is a wonderful honor to welcome once again to the show Professor Gary Saul Morson of Northwestern University. We're here to discuss his wonderful article in Commentary Magazine. It is titled, What is Russophobia? It's in the November issue of the magazine. So let's begin. Welcome, Gary, to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
Yes, and I believe last time we talked, you had a great new book came out about Russian literature, and I certainly hope that that book is doing well.
Yes, it's doing quite well, actually, and I imagine your last interview helped a bit too in sales. So um, it seems to be widely reviewed. It's called Wonder Confronts Certainty, and it's about the what's really important about the Russian literary tradition and what we can learn from it. So that it's the positive aspect of the the Russian tradition, the great writers. Um, Although I'm also thinking and writing things about what's less appealing about the Russian tradition, of which I think we're going to talk about today. They're both there.
I suppose the less appealing aspects of Russian literature that we can cover is Russophobia, as mentioned in the article, and anti-Semitism. It is, I think, no secret that some of the greatest of the Russian literary minds, I think Dostoevsky is the one that I know the best, are anti-Semites. And since the topic carries a lot of weight recently because of what is going on in the Middle East now, um, I should say that I'm reading this book right now, The Fixer by Malamud, and
Huh?
it it's a kind of a fictionalization of a real life a real event that happened in Russia where a Jew was being wrongfully accused of ritual child murder. So it has to do
This
with
is the Baylor,
yes.
the famous, yeah, right, right. That was shortly before the revolution, but there had been a number of such trials, going back decades. So it wasn't the first one, actually. Um,
So tell me about this connection between Russophobia and Jew hatred.
well, I mean, the idea of Russophobia is not necessarily connected with anti-Semitism. It just frequently is. Just like, there are many Russian patriots and nationalists who are not anti-Semitic, even though a lot of them are. For example, you couldn't call Solzhenitsyn, who's definitely a patriot or a nationalist, anti-Semitic. He's also not an imperialist. He actually believed Russia should give up its empire. um, you know, but there are many cases where the nationalism is connected with Russophobia, and Russophobia is connected with anti-Semitism. The connection of nationalism with Russophobia is the attempt to try to explain why it is. This is if you read the people who talk about Russophobia, I'll call them Russophobists, right? As opposed to Russophobes. So the Russophobists try to explain why Russia has had such a bad press in the rest of the world by saying that there is this irrational, long-term hatred for everything Russian, analogous to the hatred of Jews in the West, right? So anti-Semitism and Russophobia are parallel phenomena as far as the Russophobists are concerned. And you'd think that might make them, if they're opposed to Russophobia, opposed to anti-Semitism, but it's not. Doesn't work that way. The Russophobists typically uh, blame Jews, and particularly their own Jews, Russian Jews, for exciting all this, awful irrational hatred against everything Russian. And it's really a very interesting phenomenon that's taking place. It's grown a great deal since the fall of the Soviet Union, because the idea of what it means to be Russian, which is so, Russians are always thinking about this in the way that I think Americans are not always talking about what does it mean to be an American. I mean, it comes up every now and then, Americans think about it, but it's not an obsession the way it is for Russians. And during the Soviet period, well, to be Russian meant to be Soviet, to be leading the country that was leading the working class to communism, right? That's what it meant. It wasn't, explicitly nationalistic. In the early days of the Soviet period, the country was extremely anti-nationalistic, Russian nationalistic in particular. Starting with World War II and Stalin, Russian nationalism came to the fore, but it still wasn't how Russians defined themselves primarily. They were thinking of themselves as the bringers of world revolution, communism. But when that ideology collapsed, Russia went through a need. This is what's not appreciated, I think, in the West. It meant for Russia a spiritual vacuum, and they had this deep need to find a way to glorify their identity. I mean, we speak I know in America a great deal about identity politics. Russians have it in the extreme and have it's not new. It's a long time, right? What does it mean to be Russian? And you got various, answers to it. The ideology of Eurasianism came into play. President Putin has flirted with several different ideologies to take the place. There's been a rise of the Russian Orthodox Church, very often among people, I think, who are not even believers in Christianity, but believers in Russianness, since it's the Russian Orthodox Church. You get both. And then if you need to think about what it means to be Russian, well, you have to imagine again why so many other people don't like you, and then you produce Russophobia. The idea of Russianness has been strongly associated with the idea of Russia as a great power. It lost that after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's trying to regain it now, and which means it has to have an empire. You see, there's kind of a difference. You see, the European powers had empires, but Russia was an empire, if you get the difference. Everything was contiguous, right? It just spread out, to Siberia. And the idea of numerous Russian thinkers today think you can't imagine Russia without an empire. Well, of course, that necessarily incites suspicion of Russia abroad. But then you don't want to say that the suspicion of Russia is rational because they're expanding all the time. You attribute it to completely irrational hatreds. Right? And a whole ideology is developed. It really began in the 19th century, but it really took up speed, in the 60s and 70s, and then especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, where you try to think of the history of the world with Russia at the center and hatred of Russia at the center. Now, why that should be the case? Well, that's really interesting. And why it's connected with anti-Semitism? Well, one reason is that if you're thinking of yourself, as Russians frequently have, as the saviors of the world, a messianic people. That's how Dostoevsky, for example, thought about Russians. Not for his whole life, but let's say in the last 5 years of his life. And if Russians are the saviors of the world, then that immediately puts them into rivalry with the Jews, who in the Old Testament are the chosen people, right? And so a number of Russian thinkers have attributed their anti-Semitism to rival messianism. Okay. Can only be one chosen people. It used to be you, but it's us. Is the kind of thinking that goes on. So that accounts, for part of it. There's a strong apocalyptic element in Russian thought. Utopia or the millennium or the apocalypse is on the horizon. And in traditional, European Christian ideology, going back to the Middle Ages, there's to be a final battle between Christ and Antichrist at the end of the world. And in folklore, Antichrist is identified as a Jew. So for Dostoevsky, who really thought that the world was about to come to an end, for a few years he was, in possession of that mania. The fact that Russia's enemy, England, was headed by Prime Minister Disraeli, who was by origin a Jew, seemed to him not a coincidence. Okay. So all these things kind of come together and seem to be, strongly present now. I think the anti-Semitic element is not what's most emphasized at the present. It's the anti-Western element that is what's being emphasized right now. It could turn to it, but one of the few things you can say about President Putin that is positive is that he has not unleashed traditional Russian anti-Semitism. He easily could have. He might, but he's not. So, people say how bad President Putin is. It could be a lot worse.
Now, I do have some trouble placing President Putin in the tradition of, I guess, Russian politics and leadership. He certainly originates from the KGB, but I'm very much not sure whether he is actually a communist. He seems to liken himself to Peter the Great, but I'm also not sure to what extent is the Russian Orthodox Christian tradition influences him. So where would you place Putin in this
Well, I have to guess, of course, because I can't psychoanalyze him or see what he really thinks as opposed to the public statements he makes. But my guess would be he's not a communist. He is someone who believes deeply in Russianness and Russian power. The good thing about the communist period was that it expanded Russian power, but it was not because it was communism. On the contrary, it suppressed a lot of things that were great about Russia from a traditional point of view, including the church. And one of the things, for example, that Putin did, which was really interesting, the people who opposed the communists in the Russian Civil War, what we call them, the whites, right? Their leaders had, of course, escaped when they lost and were buried abroad. He brought back the graves, the bodies of some of these white leaders and honored them. They were just as patriotic as the Reds, right? And they wouldn't, which a strong sign that you're not a communist. It seems to be, if you do that, right? So what they had in common, the good guys are always the ones who, loved Russia, loved Russian nationalism, and he, quotes some of the, nationalist philosophers who flourished abroad, at the time. But that's compatible being part of the KGB because the KGB was an instrument of Russian power in the way the Russians think about it. That is, it was not just, projecting Russian power abroad, but the idea was that Russia can only be strong if the state is strong at home. A weak state at home means weakness abroad, and so you have to have an authoritarian Russia. And the KGB enforces that, you see. Russians have this idea that if power is decentralized, the country has to be weak, which is another thing that made communism so attractive because the economy would be centralized in that way. Now that, of course, has turned out to be disastrous. It doesn't, make you stronger, but it's still a temptation Russians always have, and to at least make the big industries like oil run by the state or state-owned, and just let the small things be run by individuals, right? They already know enough that they can't make everything planned by the state because they tried, but there's still a sense of we have to have centralized power, otherwise we're disunited, and the enemies, of Russia, who are always ready to pounce and take us, they're on our borders. They want to destroy us. One of the great Russian national holidays celebrated, for example, is the anniversary of driving out the Poles who invaded Russia and briefly ruled in 1612. Well, that's a big holiday right now. You say 1612, that's 400 years ago, but it still is in the Russian consciousness, and it's as if Poles are still welling, ready to pounce again, and that kind of thing. Next to Jews, I think Russians have the strongest hatred of Poles, when it happens. Certainly true of Dostoevsky.
So to what extent is Russophobia influences Putin's historiography in the wake of his invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, he speaks in a way that is similar to the Russophobists. I'm not sure that he is one of them, but what he says fits with it. That is that the rest of the world, meaning at this point Europe and the United States, are trying to make sure that Russia is weak. And that's their goal, to hobble Russia. And maybe after they make sure it's weak, they can go in and take it over too, buy it and rule it like everything else, turn it into another colony, of the West. And if Russia doesn't assert its power, that's what's going to happen. And the idea is Russia cannot be strong unless it unites all the East Slavic peoples. That is, the Great Russians, the Ukrainians, or who used to be called the Little Russians, and the Belarusians, right, the White Russians, right? They all, Putin will go so far as to claim that Ukrainians are not a separate people. Well, if you go back, to the time of Prince Vladimir, when Russia was Christianized over 1,000 years ago, there was no distinction. The head of the kingdom called Rus was in Kiev, and the separations come later, right? And at what point do you say it's, Ukrainian is a dialect as opposed to a separate language? Well, there's no linguistic definition of what makes a dialect and what makes a language. Why Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian are all perfectly intelligible. I know I once read a conversation between a Dane, a Swede, and a Norwegian, and each one was speaking their own language, and they had no trouble. Right? Why are they called separate languages? Because for political reasons. The saying is, a language is a dialect with an army. Well, so how different do you have to be it? Well, Ukrainian, could be thought of as a dialect of Russian. Ukrainians don't think of it that way. But if Russians want to say we're one people and we should therefore be together, that's what they will say. And that's what they did say, for, a couple of hundred years before the end of the Soviet Union, or before 1917. So that's President Putin will say they're one people, and therefore they have to be united. But what I want to know is, and I think everybody else asks this, if you are the same people, why are you killing so many civilians if you were an extreme enemy? I mean, if you're brothers, why are you treating them like the worst possible enemies, right? There seems to be a contradiction there. If you're just fighting, the government, why are you, terrorizing civilians too, right? Um, it's not entirely clear, but the idea that they have to do this because if they don't, the West will rule Ukraine, and that will be a bridgehead for taking over Russia itself. That I think they really do think that. I don't think that's just propaganda. A lot of things I say are propaganda, but I think that is how they're really thinking, because Russia really is substantially weaker now Ukraine, right? I mean, it's about, I'm making a guess here, the population of Ukraine is about a quarter of that of Russia's. That's a very large addition, but it's also the most fertile land, that the country has. It's historically it's the source of the place, it's the home of the place. All sorts of great battles are fought there. It's felt to be an essential part of it, right? But that's looking from a Russian point of view. From a Ukrainian point of view, it looks, particularly in the Western Ukraine, large parts of Ukraine were ruled for centuries not by the Russian Empire, but by Poles and the Austrian Empire. Those westernized Ukrainians are particularly anti-Russian. They do not think of themselves having anything to do, with Russians. And, from their perspective, they're looking at it in much the same way that Poles look at it. This is a country which is trying to take us over, and we're different, right? In the extreme east, that's less the case. There are more Russian speakers, and that's why presumably the Russians moved in to take it over, that part of the country over. Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian speakers. That was never considered part of Ukraine at all till Khrushchev, sort of as a gift in the 50s, gave it to Ukraine. But it's not historically Ukrainian. So they could take that over, and then send their armies into eastern Ukraine, which is the main Russian-speaking one. And lots of people thought they would stop there because that's the Russian-speaking areas primarily, but evidently not. I mean, they seem to think they can take over the whole thing.
Of course, Ukrainians have their historical reasons to be against Russia, with Stalin's just famine, the Holodomor, and everything.
Right. Yes, I mean, I don't know how much your audience knows about that, but during the collectivization of agriculture, it was particularly brutal. This is, the Soviets we're talking about, the Bolsheviks, who one of the centers of ideology was that we do not believe in the sanctity of human life. If you do, you're religious, and we're materialists. So you do things in the most brutal way possible. And agriculture was collectivized, in part by just starving people out, taking all their grain, and then letting them starve over the winter. And, the collectivization of agriculture in Ukraine, I don't know, people don't know exactly how many people it killed, but the order of magnitude is something of several million, right? And you have to, when you've gone through that, you can imagine that it doesn't make you terribly pro-Russian. Of course, Russian nationalists today, you see, look at that differently. They see it not as the imposition of Russians on Ukrainians. They think of it as part of communism, of which Russians themselves were the principal victims. So they're both victims of it, right? So, it was coming out of Moscow, but not because it was Russian, but because it was communist, right? So that's how the Russian, I'm trying to give you how the different points of view, but you can imagine as a Ukrainian, it's coming out of Moscow. The government is basically run by Russians, right? Even Stalin, who was not Russian, was a Russian nationalist in his policies. Um, so naturally, they see this as Russian, and they don't, they don't want to take a chance on being part of that country again. I don't know anybody who would, having gone through that experience, right?
And of course, those who are really religious in the Orthodox sense, they can justify communism as a Jewish phenomenon, given that there were Jewish people in the communist movement, and some of the principal characters of communism, Marx and Trotsky and co. Were Jewish ethnically.
Yes, of course they were not. People say they were not Jewish religiously. Marx himself was an extreme anti-Semite, despite his origins. Yes, if you read his essay on the Jewish question, it's about as anti-Semitic as you can get. Trotsky really resented being called Jewish, but he was ethnically Jewish, and a substantial number of the early Bolsheviks were let's put it this way, they were non-Russian. Not just Jews, but other, non-Russians, Lithuanians, for the obvious reasons that, the empire, a lot of Poles in the movement, the Russian Empire was engaged in Russification. So it makes sense that the non-Russian peoples would be particularly resentful, right, of it. And the Jews played a particularly, prominent role. So if you're Russian and you want to excuse Russia from the terrible crimes of Stalin and Lenin, you can do it in two ways. You can say, well, there's all these Jews involved, as you mentioned. You can also say it was a Western German ideology imposed on us. Marx was a German, but we are not. It's another example of the West torturing us. Is how you will try to, and I've heard, even Americans who were, sympathetic with Russia use that argument. It seems very peculiar to me because, when Russians are ruled in communism, well, everyone identified, including themselves, with communism, right? They're true. And as soon as it's not fashionable, then it's Westerners. I mean, that doesn't seem to hold much sense, I think.
Now,
But if you want to excuse yourself, it's there.
so how would the Westernized Russians view, well, their home country of Russia?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that really has irritated Russian nationalists, let's say let's say the 1830s, is that the strongest anti-Russian statements, almost all of them, come from Russians themselves, or from Westerners saying the same thing that Russians say about themselves. So, Westerners say Russians are, imperialistic. Russians themselves say Russians are imperialistic. What's the problem there? Russians have there's a whole group of Russians who, starting with this guy, Pyotr Chadayev in the 1830s, who did an extraordinary essay saying that Russia is forlorn. It is a country that has contributed nothing to world civilization. Cut off from the West because of the Mongol conquest for 240 years, it has developed without any connection to all the Renaissance and all the Western movements. It has contributed nothing, to world civilization. If it didn't exist, the world would be no worse off. This is all what Chadayev says, and then you get several. This tradition continues, right? There's a good, quite a number of the Westernizers thought in this way, maybe not to that degree, but some to that degree. There's a character in one of Turgenev's novels who obviously is meant to represent this, who says, "Look, it's true. Russians have contributed nothing. We didn't even invent the samovar," he says. Right? It's a very funny line, right? And then you get, in the modern period, people trying to explain Russian authoritarianism by some aspect of the Russian character that gravitates to that. Some have gone so far as to say that, if you try to give Russians freedom, they don't want it. They will throw it away because they are naturally slaves and want to be dominated. And you get this being said, by Russians. Okay. Now, the Russophobists will point out that some of these Russians who say it are Jews, but certainly not all of them, right? And what they seem mostly to resent, when I was investigating this, what really struck me was what they most resent, these Russophobists, are the things that other Russians say about them. They blame Westerners for it, people over there, but the ones that really irritate them are the Russians who say it. Right? Like this, Russia has a slave soul, particularly, irritating to them. But you see why they say it after all. Every time Russia had a chance for, to have a free government in 1917, again, the fall of communism, it didn't take root. Why was that? Well, one explanation is that Russians don't want that kind of thing, right? Now, that's one step from there to saying they have a slave soul. They're not identical, of course, but either way, it feels as if it's an insult to the Russian character. So, and those things will be most hurtful if said by Russians themselves. Now, some Westerners have, said, the other group of Westerners who have said that most forcefully, there are two of them who really irritate Russians. One, in the 1830s or 1840s, and then one in the Stalin period. There was this French aristocrat, the Marquis de Custine, who took a trip to Russia and wrote about it. And he went to Russia loving it, in order to say, we Westerners need a government, an authoritarian government. He didn't like all Western liberalism, right? But what he saw there so horrified him. He had been thinking by authoritarian government, he thought it was something like a soft version, like in Austria, where they still have laws and rights. What he saw in Russia so appalled him that he came back and wrote a book about it, which is incredibly insulting to Russians in the Russian society. And then something similar happened in the Stalin period when they invited, they tried to invite all these Western intellectuals who were communists to Russia to praise it. One of them they invited was André Gide, the French novelist. And he has an extraordinary essay he writes about why this trip to Russia convinced him not to be a communist. Everything, and it's extraordinarily strong, this essay. And that's another, these two figures, the Marquis de Custine and Gide, precisely because they started out loving Russia, but when they went there, changed their mind. This is particularly, that's just about as bad as the Russians who hate Russia.
Mhm. So, is it the case that the Russians, whatever type of regime or governance they happen to have, see centralized authority as a source of their power?
It's certainly been, the tradition. Obviously, there are people who disagree with that. There were, throughout the 19th century, there were liberals today, but they don't have much of a social base. right? In the 19th century, you know, there really, in England and France, the social base of liberal ideas was a strong bourgeoisie and middle class. Russia didn't have that. Right? The people who were liberals were intellectuals or lawyers or professors who brought the ideas in, but that's without a social base an economic base, in the society. They were never really very strong. Um, but the authoritarian idea, well, the first really great, you know, Russian historian who people still read was this writer, Nikolai Karamzin, who also, he wrote his history of Russia, which is a beautifully written thing. And he wrote, advice to the Tsar. Um, the point being that Russia, the Tsar must never yield any of his authoritarian power, no constitution, right? Because Russia is all, and he wrote the history, Russia's always weak when it's divided, right? And he even says at one point, what the people say to you, Tsar, and of course he's speaking for himself when he says the people always are. What the people say to you is, you are the sovereign, you can do anything you like, except one thing, limit your power. That's the one thing you may not do, okay? And, now compare that with the even greater power, claimed by Lenin in his dictatorship of the proletariat. And the Tsars never dreamed of doing some of the things, Lenin did. But that idea, it somehow seemed, as if, to Lenin and his followers, if they had that much power, they could perform miracles. They could do anything. Right? So if you look at, the early Soviet period, by miracles, I mean, it was commonly believed, intellectuals, that since we can perform miracles, Engels called it the leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom, when the laws of nature no longer determine you, you determine the laws of nature. That within a few years, they will know how to raise the dead and create immortality for people. That's what I mean by, they thought that you could perform miracles. And it's because they could only do it because they had such centralized power that they could direct all their resources to one goal, whatever it might be.
Right. So I think one note we can conclude on is to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church as a whole. I think that Russian art, at least the ones that I've been exposed to, it's at its best when it appeals to this great Orthodox tradition. I think the Soviet era certainly did a number on it. And what I hear from the Russian Orthodox Church these days is that it is totally subordinate to the state, i.e. Putin, and that the Grand Patriarch is basically parroting Putin's line of propaganda when it comes to Ukraine. So do you believe that there's a chance that this Orthodox cultural, religious, artistic tradition can make it again?
Well, first, I wouldn't say that Patriarch Kirill is parroting Putin. That suggests he's just saying, following Putin's orders. I think he believes it just as much as Putin does. I think it's his real beliefs. um, when you think the great Orthodox artistic tradition, are you thinking the medieval icon painters? I mean, because if you think of great Russian literature, of course, that is not primarily, in the Orthodox tradition, right? 19th, well, there's an Orthodox influence on, Russian painting and music in the 19th century, but it's, not primarily Orthodox. But can you go back to the kind of, let's say, pre-revolutionary tradition when there was an Orthodox atmosphere and when they were actually creative as opposed to repressive? That's a good question. I don't know. To do that, I think you would first have to have orthodoxy being something people believed in as a form of Christianity. and not just as a form of Russian nationalism. And I've had friends who go to Russia, who tell me they see people with Orthodox, with Russian crosses, but when you speak to them, they're not interested in, Christian dogma, in Jesus, in the New Testament. It's just a way of saying I'm a Russian patriot. You'd have to really get the point where Christianity again suffused Russian culture. Dostoevsky was genuinely Christian, right? He wasn't just nationalist. I mean, for him, he really believed in Christianity, as many of the, writers did. And when he spoke about Christianity, it's really hard to distinguish very often between what you'd get in Western Europe, right? If you could get that again, then you might, I guess, get a strong Orthodox art. But I don't see how you're going to get it from people for whom it's simply a way of saying I'm a Russian patriot.
Of course, I don't expect the Russian Orthodox Church to adopt this our Western idea of separation of church and state. But one thing I certainly am worried about is that the idea that a church is connected to a nation. So Russian Orthodox, that's a phrase. So is there a way that that Russians can separate the idea of the church, Christianity, which is a universal idea, with the nation, which has borders?
Yes, and I mean that really is, is the question, and it's becoming more and more now because there were it was the Russian Orthodox Church had many representatives abroad. The East Slavs in general, were part of it. But there are large numbers of Ukrainians. Those Ukrainians are now maybe we'll have our own patriarch now. We'll Ukrainian Orthodox. And they got their own patriarch recently, right? So it's becoming more and more national. That's the original. If you go back far enough, the reason that Russians associated their people with Christianity and identified the two is that they were Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox Church. But when the center of the Eastern Orthodox religion fell to the Turks in Constantinople, right, they remained the only independent Orthodox power. All the rest were under the Muslim rule, right? And so to be Russian and to be Christian seemed to me the same thing. But you see, as you point out, there's a real danger in that, right? I mean, because Christianity should be a universal religion. It should not be, we love just a form of saying Russians are better. That's not in the spirit of the religion. So there's a tension, and there always has been, since that point, right? And there are Russians who are, think of themselves as genuine Christians who happen to be Russian, and the reverse, right? I mean, so yeah, it's a problem in a way that, for example, Catholics and Protestants very rarely have, right? I mean, even Anglicans who you think would have to be English don't seem to have that problem so much, right?
I think we can end on that note. Thank you very much, Professor Gary Saul Morson.
Thank you again.